Good afternoon, Philosophy 2030, and thank you for tuning in to the last presentation of the philosophers. Today, we will be discussing the death penalty using two cases of exonerated death row inmates. To add to this discussion, I will be joined via satellite video by David Delinko and Immanuel Kant. Mr. Delinko, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
What point of view will you be bringing to this discussion?
I will be talking about the three procedural issues here. The first is the arbitrariness issue, the second is the discrimination issue, and the third is the mistake issue.
Thank you, Mr. Delinko. Mr. Kant, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
What point of view will you be bringing to this discussion?
I'll be talking about my theory of retributivism, which is based on the two principles that wrongdoers should be punished and the punishment should fit the crime.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. Let's get right into the case. The first case is David Keaton versus Florida.
Keaton was convicted in 1971 on the basis of mistaken identification and coerced confessions. Keaton was sentenced to death for murder of an off-duty deputy sheriff during a robbery. The state Supreme Court reversed the conviction and granted Keaton a new trial because of newly discovered evidence. Charges were dropped in 1973, and Keaton was released after the actual killer was identified and convicted.
Mr. Delinko, what procedural issues do you see in this case?
There are two procedural issues in Keaton versus Florida. The first is that it is empirically shown that the killers of whites are more likely to receive capital punishment or the death penalty than killers of blacks. A 1990 review shows that in 82% of cases, the race of the victim is a distinguishable factor in whether or not that person will get the death penalty or not. This is a finding that's remarkably consistent across data sets, states, data collection techniques. Being that capital punishment is inflicted in a racially discriminatory manner, it's more easy to be manipulated, and this is talking about his coerced confession. This leads into my second issue, the mistake issue. If David Keaton wouldn't have been exonerated, then an innocent man would have been put to death, which is an irrevocable sentence, unlike life imprisonment, where later on he could have been freed. For this reason, mistakes in capital sentencing are unavoidable.
Thank you, Mr. Delinko. Mr. Kant, do you have anything you would like to add about the Keaton versus Florida case?
In this case, I think that the punishment was appropriate for the crime.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. We will now move on to the second case. Samuel A. Poole versus North Carolina.
After being convicted in 1973 of first-degree burglary and given a mandatory death sentence, Poole had his conviction overturned in 1974 by the North Carolina Supreme Court because of the lack of substantial evidence that Poole was the person who broke into the home.
Mr. Delinko, what procedural issues do you see in this case?
The main argument for this case is that the death penalty is actually inflicted arbitrarily, which is without any rationale, because this case actually involved first-degree burglary. And once again, we see the mistake issue with this case. If Mr. Poole was not exonerated, then an innocent man would have been put to death. And again, this is an irrevocable sentence. If Mr. Poole had been put to death, the person who actually committed the crime might never have been found, but with him being exonerated, they could actually find the person who committed the crime, and if they had put him to death, they more than likely would have closed his case.
Thank you, Mr. Delinko. Mr. Kant, do you have anything you'd like to add to this case?
Yes, I do. The biggest issue in this case is that the crime does not match the punishment. My theory involves principles of punishment. The first being that people should be punished for committing crimes and that the punishment must be proportionate to the crime. My second principle does endorse capital punishment, but only in the response to murder is death appropriate.
Mr. Kant, it seems like your theory rejects the utilitarian theory of punishment. Can you explain to us why you reject the theory?
I reject the utilitarian theory of punishment because the theory is incompatible with human dignity, which can be explained in two ways. First, it causes us to calculate how to use people as means to our ends. If we imprison the criminal in order to keep society safe, then we are merely using them for the benefits of others. Second, rehabilitation is just the attempt to mold people into what we want them to be, which violates their right to decide for themselves what sort of people they will become.
Thank you, Mr. Kant and Mr. Delinko, for joining us today. That's all the time we have. Thank you for watching our last presentation of the year, and we hope that you enjoyed our discussion of the death penalty.